It's great to be in Richmond. It's not my first time in Richmond. I've always found it a feast, an architectural feast, because of the tremendous variety here. It seems to me to surpass most other cities. We were going through Carytown tonight. I thought for Memphis is like Dublin. You run into that sort of thing all over Richmond. We're staying in Linden Row, which all the porches you see, all the back porches. There's this enormous, endless variety here. It seems to have been preserved. So congratulations to some of these 100-year-old organizations here who have done it. As was said, I have done research on the White House for years and years and years, and I've done research not so many years on the Confederate White House. Though I've known the Confederate White House for years, first time I was here, I went in each room, state had a room, and I unfortunately mentioned that at dinner. And being from Texas, they mocked the Texas room with considerable glee, with deer antlers and cow horn furniture, all big and vulgar and appropriate to Texas, if I remember the quote. Anyway, I noticed they preserved it in the basement for very special guests. The two domestic circles I want to talk about tonight occupied the White House in Washington and the White House in Richmond. The houses themselves are two very different expressions in architecture. And while the Lincolns and the Davises are my subject, the two images, the two buildings, are the settings for my subject and naturally important to it. Let's pause for a few minutes and talk about these two houses. One house, by reputation, a premier American symbol, is not architecturally especially American at all, while the other, representing a turbulent era of 4 years, is one of the outstanding examples of American neoclassical architecture, and thus is very American. By their histories, both are knitted close into the fabric of the American story. The White House in Washington was an odd house in the American context. If it weren't so familiar to us, it would seem even more odd. It was built in the 1790s by a government and a president quite uncertain and self-conscious about how a chief executive under the new Constitution should present himself to the world. Of course, it was before the age of mass communications, so the audience was not so instant as it would be today. Yet George Washington knew that the eyes of the Western world were upon him and would judge how he conducted himself. The President of the United States could easily have been dismissed as a buffoon in a comic opera if his performance was less than perfect. He knew that very well. A logical man, Washington considered various options. For ceremony, he pared down the customs practiced by George III, as reported to him by John Adams and John Jay, both of whom had participated in that. For an official house, which the Constitution specified be built, the Frenchman Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, in designing Washington, planned and actually dug cellars for a palatial house 5 times the size of the White House ultimately built. Had the work not been interrupted, the palace would undoubtedly have continued. But the departure of the designer and the difficulty getting workmen and materials played on the project until Washington finally looked up a local builder he'd met in Charleston, South Carolina. James Hoban, a native of Ireland, presented him with a model to follow, the president, the house of the Duke of Leinster in Dublin, Ireland. To Washington, this seemed appropriate, not a palace, but a gentleman's house. He tolerated Jefferson's public competition for a design, but was sold from the start on what he and James Hoban had cooked up. And that, with modifications, is what became the White House that you know. In design generically, this house was an import from Georgian Ireland, huge by American standards, immense. It was of dressed stone, which was specified by Washington himself. This was to be the residence, ceremonial hall, and business office of the President of the United States. It has remained for more than 2 centuries with many additions, yet at the core, about the same house. The building we know as the White House of the Confederacy was quite otherwise. It was built 1816-18 as a private house for the rich banker, Dr. John Brokenrow, President of the Bank of Virginia, one of the nation's first state banks and more successful than most. The architect of attribution is Robert Mills, who had been a draftsman in James Hovind's Washington office while the White House was being built, and was in Richmond at the time building a beautiful monumental church, which is a jewel on Broad Street. Brokenborough was a two-story late federal house built of brick over a raised basement, a large house by any American standard at that time, but still domestic in scale, which the White House was not. The columned porch on the garden side was remarkable for that time, anticipating the galleries that come to mind today as signatures of the so-called plantation style of house. Certainly the Brokenborough house was elegant, reflecting a very prosperous period of Richmond and indeed American history, a time dubbed the era of good feelings that followed the War of 1812, the Second War of Independence from England. Brokenborough and his bank survived the Panic of 1819 that ended the era of good feelings very quickly, and later the collapse of the state banks after Andrew Jackson's disastrous bank wars in the 1830s. He sold the house in 1852, a few years before his death. It passed through several hands and came into its present form probably under the residency of James A. Seddon in the 1850s, when the third story was added, and the stucco may have been applied then and scored to resemble stone. No change seems to have been made to the porch. The interior was heavily altered with modern details like cast plaster ceiling ornaments. Thus updated, the house should have been in good condition when the city of Richmond bought it for $35,000, June the 1st, 1861, the month before the Confederate Congress convened here. It was rented by the Confederate government, which provided a house for the president, as was done in the United States. In August, Mary Boykin Chestnut wrote in her diary that Brokenborough House was really a handsome establishment. Throughout the Civil War, it was always called the Brokenborough House, never the White House. As Mrs. Chestnut wrote, the house had already begun its journey into the limelight in the most turbulent drama in American history. 5 months before Abraham Lincoln had walked into the house he would occupy for the duration of that same time. Abraham Lincoln, a well-known corporation lawyer in the Midwest, had been a prominent citizen of Springfield, Illinois. Indeed, had he continued with the law, he would almost certainly have relocated to Chicago, which is where he and his wife planned to move after the White House anyway, and we're looking at lots on Michigan Avenue. He made no secret of and created a unique public image from his humble origins, although they were not all that different or harder than those of a vast number of Americans, including, at least in his early years, Jefferson Davis. Very unlike Davis, Lincoln had turned his back on his family, adopting to ally himself to the more genteel kin of his wife, Mary Todd of Kentucky, and friends of similar status that he had made since he had left home. Lincoln had his public faith, the one we all know so well. His wife labored to keep up appearances that suggested refinement. With a little inheritance, she added a second floor to their wooden cottage in Springfield, moved the bedrooms upstairs, and maintained 3 parlors, and not one had a bed in it, and a dining room below, in the original house. She was proud, and her pretensions Lincoln liked to poke fun. Lincoln did very well financially. He was not rich, but early on he had developed political interests that had rivaled his pursuit of money. In the 1850s, from the boiling sectional controversy, he had emerged as a new man to challenge a hamstrung government going nowhere. The Democratic electorate split the new Republican Party and carried Lincoln to victory. No, that's wrong. The Democratic electorate was split, and the Republicans carried Lincoln to victory. Sorry. He moved from Springfield with his wife and 3 sons to take up life anew in Washington. Whether at that time he had in mind freeing the slaves will probably never be known, but he did sense there was a great danger to the Union in current events and prayed that Americans would listen to their better angels. As the nation began splitting apart with secessions of states, he, as had President Jackson before him, saw the perpetual curse, the house divided. It would forever hold the United States if it were allowed to prevail. This much we know he thought. No question, Lincoln entered a capital and emotional crisis. The administration of the old Jacksonian, James Buchanan, had been one of political eruptions, resignations. Indeed, invitations to the White House were very carefully mixed in Buchanan's time, particularly later in his administration, to avoid loud arguments and even the possibility of fights across the dinner table. This had been a particular horror at the White House since the 1820s, when two of James Monroe's diplomat guests drew swords across his dinner table. As far as the presidency was concerned, Buchanan was as troubled as Lincoln by the secessionist threat to the survival of the Union. In his last State of the Union message in December of 1860, Buchanan's principal point was a strong Jacksonian one, that the South had no constitutional right to secede. The real problem lay in what followed. Buchanan could find no legal way in which the government could intervene and stop secession. South Carolina cannon had been drawn up in the standoff at Fort Sumter and Moultrie. The dilemma of sectionalism was concentrated in that dilemma in Charleston Harbor, inherited by Lincoln. Suffering the tense situation and emotional storms, not to mention the hovering threat of assassination, Lincoln had to face the simple challenge of situating himself as president. While in the context of the times it may seem a minor matter, he, like presidents before him and yet to come, were very concerned with how they would live in the White House. He had been there as a guest in the 1840s during the Mexican War, never a very important guest, when he served in Congress. It occurred to him long before he moved to the White House that there were many issues involved in living there that amounted to important, perhaps complicated decisions. The White House was also, after all, a context in which he would be seen and judged. And of course, it's where history sees him. He sent his secretary, Belgian-born George Nicolay, to Washington in advance to have a meeting with the outgoing Secretary of State, Jeremiah Black. It would be difficult to imagine such a session without William Hunter, the aged assistant secretary, who was a one-man protocol office at the State Department. The men talked for several hours. Nicolay made notes, some of which survived, and even drawings of how dinners were seated, appointments made, diplomats treated, and bills paid. In those days, official entertaining was entirely in the hands of the Department of State in the White House. Everything else was paid for by the president, who received a $20,000 allowance each term for the House and those incidentals that might come up. One of Nicolay's sketches shows the dining table set for 60, which was the maximum in those days, with a placement of the president and his wife directly across the center of the table, and the other guests arranged by rank all along. There being at that time, and for some years to come, no set White House staff, every president, in a sense, started anew. It was as though Lincoln had moved into a new house. These early transitions were very informal things, and there would be no forms in transition attempted until Eisenhower transferred the House to John F. Kennedy, and for which Kennedy's father paid the bill entirely. After that, the transition was institutionalized. The committee set to work raising funds as soon as a candidate is nominated. Staff for the White House in Lincoln's time was likely not to know the ropes. He was able to retain a few of the old staff, but it had all been changed by Buchanan from largely African American entirely to white people, most of them trained British or European servants. The presence of African Americans, which had been traditional at the White House from the very first, aroused controversy among Northern guests. Lincoln's secretary was able to persuade 4 or 5 of Buchanan's staff of 15 to remain, at least for the time. On March the 4th, 1861, Lincoln left his hotel and called at the White House. Buchanan and his cabinet descended from the upstairs office, and as Buchanan quipped, "Uncle Abe is in the red room below. Let us not keep him waiting." From there, President and President-elect were driven in an open carriage to the Capitol for the swearing in on the East Portico. Women took part only as spectators, and the honored ladies were already being seated at the Capitol when the presidents left the White House. Inaugural parades then were ragtag sorts of things. The first was after Andrew Jackson's inauguration, and you'd hardly call it a parade, kind of a mob, where the crowds followed the frail new president, who was mounted on a horse, could barely make it on the horse himself, and steadied in the saddle by his friends who surrounded him on foot. Lincoln's inauguration had a few floats, some military companies in uniform, and a great throng walking along at the end. The crowd, some 8,000 people, poured through the north door of the White House into the Blue Room, where Lincoln and Buchanan shook hands with each of them as the seemingly endless line threatened on to the East Room. Nothing was served so that the crowds would not linger, and the first wave would make way for the second wave, would make way for the third wave, until finally they put stairs up to one of the windows of the east room so that people could get out and not have to thread their way back to the door. Then the crowd was gone and the gas lights lit. Buchanan went to his hotel, his White House rooms empty of any evidence of him. He left the Lincolns with a formidable memory of an administration now over that had outshone in social splendor any other before it in the history of the White House. Buchanan had welcomed the first Japanese delegation to America. He had entertained the Prince of Wales, the first royal to sleep in the White House. His niece and hostess, Harriet Lane, who was 20, had festooned the dinner tables with ropes of roses, casting out the wax flowers historically used there. And she led promenades along the alleys made of tubs, fruit trees, and palms from the greenhouse. And she and her young friends waltzed until dawn in the East Room to the music of the Marine Band. Listen to the Mockingbird was one of several songs written for her. Abraham Lincoln was 52, and Mary Todd Lincoln was 42, about a decade his junior. They had married on November the 4th, 1842. Of the Lincolns' 4 sons, 3 lived to move to the White House, and 1 would die there. The eldest, Bob, was 17, a cold fish if there ever was one, and a slow learner. The middle boy, Willie, was 10, bright and clever. Tom, or Tad, the youngest, was 7, spoiled rotten and mischievous and not at all inclined to books. The Lincoln family of 5 wandered quite alone in a big echoing house that they knew all too little about. For the White House to look a little worn out, or it might be said wilted, is not unusual in the eyes of a new administration when they arrive. People who lived hard there for 4 years, maybe 8, and it gets worn out. Contrary to popular opinion, no first family takes pleasure in redecorating the White House. Redecorating comes from necessity. For the Kennedys, it was a necessity because it was necessary to create a setting, something well apart from the everyday tone of the idolized Eisenhower. The Nixons had to freshen up what had really become shabby from use, and they developed a wish to add a museum quality of permanence through valuable antiques to what the Kennedys had started. For such tasks, private money must be raised. Getting it all done is a first-class inconvenience to lives that are already extraordinarily busy. For the Lincolns, the pace of the White House living was a little different, if only it occupied fewer hours of the day. Fewer hours. To them, the old house must at first have seemed very grand. Lincoln commented that it was a house better than any they'd ever known before. It looked a bit like a fine hotel that had dimmed in its colorful glory. A lot of it needed repair and sprucing up. The glorious red-headed Harriet Lane had about dined and danced it down. Her experience with her uncle at St. James in London and her intimacy with the British royal family brought panache to a household that would have had very little sparkle if left to dry old Uncle James. A man who, as Minister Plenipotentiary of Britain, was denied admission to a royal function once because he was dressed improperly. Mrs. Jefferson Davis once remarked that he always looked so clean. Many years after the Buchanan administration, characters like Davis and General U.S. Grant would recall the color and splendor of what they called Miss Lane's court. Mary Todd Lincoln had to meet the obstacle of following the youthful Miss Lane, and no one felt the challenge more sharply or deeply than she. And for the first time in American history, the press, looking on, would make comparisons that were more often unkind than not. One entered Lincoln's White House from the north in an echoing hallway 40 feet wide, with an 18-foot ceiling hung with heavy gas chandeliers. Here the doormen stood guard. Their pistols were concealed, but they were all armed. Immediately across from the north door was a shallow arcade supported by 4 Pennsylvania blue marble columns. Window sash like an ordinary greenhouse was fitted between the columns all across with French doors that opened into a long transverse hall. Along this secondary transverse hall were the parlors, already called by their historic names, the blue, red, and green rooms. At the hall's left, or east end, was the east room, and far down to the right was an odd double flight of stairs to the second floor, office, and private quarters. Flanking the stairs were 2 dining rooms on the main floor, the public or state dining room on the south and the family dining room on the north, looking out through a screening of pine trees to Pennsylvania Avenue. A small corridor beside the family dining room contained a narrow, twisting stair that linked the basement kitchens to the attic. Lincoln learned early that he could thread this back stair unseen when he wished to leave the house. The parlors were about like one might have expected in the house of a rich banker or businessman, maybe in Chicago or Rochester. Wallpapered in gilt French papers, various rich upholsteries and carpeting followed the traditional color themes of the rooms, while great gold-framed mirrors reflected it all in that Versailles sort of way so loved in ballrooms and old-time barbershops. The flavoring of the White House at that time, captured ironically perhaps, if smaller scale, is captured in the restored Confederate White House today. That Frenchy, opulent, showy, and precious was the style of the era of Napoleon III. Harriet Lane had refurnished the blue room in heavy gold furniture in this style, climaxed by a circular sofa or ottoman that sat in the middle of the room and is mentioned admiringly in probably every visitor's diary who toured the White House at that time and for the next 45 years. It's in storage today. The state dining room and east room were large rooms at opposite ends of the house. Between uses, they seemed nearly vacant. All the state rooms shared the tired appearance of worn paths and carpets, smudged wallpaper by thousands of visitors, and a tear here and there in the curtains where a relic-minded visitor took a sample with his, or often her, pocket knife. During the day, the shutters were closed against the south sun, and the rooms had a shadowy presence, the shaded daylight dancing in white lace curtains. At night, when the gas was lighted, yellow glow pervaded and played in the crimson and green and royal blue silks, the marble and the polished rosewood. The Lincoln family lived in the west end of the second floor, only 7 rooms, while the east end was given entirely to the president's offices. They were packed with people morning to night. A separate stair went up to the president's office. A long, dark, windowless passage connected these two parts of the house. The personal rooms offered 5 bedrooms and a few dressing rooms that in a pinch could have beds set up in them. All of the bedrooms had high post beds with curtains that could be tucked in at night, making a tent for warmth. There was a ghastly heating system, but it was so dry people had sore throats all the time, and they left buckets of water all over the place to try to moisten the air. The only sitting room upstairs was the oval library over the blue room. Its low ceiling made it seem cramped compared to the lofty rooms below. There was a collection of books in that room, funded by the Congress the decade before for Mrs. Millard Fillmore, wife of President Fillmore in 1852. Lincoln's usual reading was the Bible, but he also read Shakespeare often and the various English poets. Mrs. Lincoln liked novels and poetry. In their love of the books, the Lincolns were a companionable couple. At best, the president's office was cramped. No details survived of how Lincoln or Nicolay adapted the office, but the suite was changed during the first few months. As we all learned in the school, office and favor seekers appeared at the White House in waves to profit from the new president and the victorious new National Party. In theory, any party emptied the federal payroll and replaced every employee. They didn't often do that. William Henry Harrison did, but most didn't. It really didn't happen 100% in fact, but there were many changes, and Lincoln's callers were not opposed to suggesting where changes might be made and fit them in. Favor seekers came by the thousands. No exception, perhaps the best example of all, was Benjamin Brown French, who wished to be Commissioner of Public Buildings, one of the most desirable and easiest federal jobs in town. He called constantly, stood in line, waited as the procession moved him closer and closer along the upstairs, the long stairs to the ground glass doors, and at last into the reception room, and maybe to Lincoln, but often Lincoln would leave and wouldn't get to meet him. This consummate office seeker did write wonderful diaries and letters, things that happened. Much of what we know comes from his Benjamin B. French's letters, and there is an addition of that. The office was a simple matter. There being little furniture at that time, it would be called office furniture. Imagine rooms with domestic chairs and cabinets and occasional very basic sort of table or cupboard commissioned from a carpenter. The cabinet table where the Emancipation Proclamation was written was just such an object, a long table with drawers, probably replacing an old one, a table much like the kitchen table lost in the fire of 1814 that had been built for Thomas Jefferson. Each cabinet member had a drawer at that long table, and when he arrived for a cabinet meeting, he found that George Nicolay had put in that drawer any correspondence the president was turning over to the cabinet member for action. It was that simple. It's such an elaborate situation now compared to that. Maybe. The cabinet room and Lincoln's own office were one and the same, today known as the Lincoln bedroom. The reception room was merely a walled-off end of a transverse hall upstairs, adjacent to one side of the office, and gave Lincoln private access into the family quarters. The files were kept in boxes and trunks, filing cabinets, and they were all filed. Things were all filed in their envelopes. Across the hall was the bedroom of Nicolay and his assistant John Hay, which matched the office of Lincoln. That was the extent of the office suite used by Lincoln in the Civil War. Here his meetings took place. Here he tenaciously defended the Union and held the Confederacy to a level of rebellion. And here he at last finalized the Emancipation Proclamation for certain and signed it here on New Year's Day, 1863, after a long and harrowing reception in the East Room below. Here thus were freed the slaves in the states in rebellion. I dare say no one here needs for me to reiterate tonight the political and war biography of Lincoln. We'll turn from the White House to the other White House, 98 miles away, and probably the longest 98 miles on the American continent. If the Lincolns were new stars on the national stage, then Jefferson Davis could be considered by 1861 a public figure already well established as a political leader for a very much longer time. Like Lincoln, he had been born in Kentucky in humble circumstances. Unlike Lincoln, he benefited from parents who became successful planters in Mississippi near the Louisiana border early on. Provided with a college education, he went to West Point, was an engineer. He first drew public attention in the Mexican War when his brilliant plan for the siege of Monterrey, Mexico, made him famous in military circles all over the world, much as George Washington was made famous in military circles all over the world in the French and Indian War. In the U.S. Senate from Mississippi, serving in Washington, Davis was one of the bright lights of the Congress. He left the Senate to serve as Secretary of War under President Pierce. Returning to the Senate, he was among many positions, chair of the committee that remodeled the Capitol, building the Great Iron Dome that was to become, ironically, a symbol of union during the Civil War. His position on states' rights solidified during the tumultuous 50s. He was committed to preserve what he called the principles of an older America, the original America. The Provisional Congress at Montgomery, Alabama, elected a reluctant Davis president of the Confederacy in January of 1861, in haste to get a government established before Lincoln's inauguration, which was 2 months later. A year later, Davis was elected to a 6-year term and inaugurated here in Richmond. By that time, Davis already occupied the Rockefeller House. Davis's wife, Verena Howell Davis, who had married the widow Davis in 1845, was 35 years old. He was 53 in the summer of 1861. When they moved to the president's house with their daughter Maggie, who was 6, and sons Jeff and Joe, 2, Mrs. Davis was pregnant, and just before Christmas 1861 gave birth to Billy. The last child, born toward the end of the residency in this house, was born in 1864 and was to be the most famous of their children, Verena, named for her mother and given the same nickname Jefferson Davis always called his wife, Winnie. The official house of the President of the Confederacy was an elegant building, but seems not to have been lived in fully since the departure of the glamorous 70s. Some furniture had been acquired for it by the government when they rented the house from the city for Davis's use. It was not, or purchased the house. It was not adequate. The house was purchased by the government and rented. Davis would not accept it as a gift, and it was rented by the government. In any case, it was not adequately furnished. Mrs. Davis very carefully ordered a considerable quantity of furniture and ornaments from Europe, but the resulting shipment was soon trapped by the Union blockade and never arrived in Richmond. The Davises made do. A British journalist who toured the house in the month the Confederacy fell, found the fine building and beautiful parlors done up in red velvet. During the war, General Lee paused at the door to the reception room, fearing his boots would track mud on the white ground of the carpeting. Several of the Davis' slaves from his Mississippi plantation, Briarfield, her family home was called the Briars, and he named his plantation Briarfield. These slaves accompanied them wherever they went, and lived, and Richmond was no exception. Among these, Jim Pemberton was the principal and the most beloved, the butler and son of John Pemberton, a long-time valet and really companion of Davis. He went everywhere Davis went. Several maids who had traveled with the family were always also in residence in the Richmond house. The rest were hired, nearly all of them free African Americans, residents of Richmond, including coachmen, nurses, waiters, grooms in varying numbers over the years, and not of least importance, the cook, whom I think was white, I'm not sure, who had been previously employed on one of the transatlantic steamers. Setting up and functioning in an official establishment was easier for the Davises than for the Lincolns, clearly. But there was no burden of tradition whatsoever attached to their parvenu White House. They borrowed traditions from Washington. That's what they knew. Throughout the 1850s, the Davises had been leaders in Washington political society, well accustomed to the forms of diplomatic and political life. They entertained elegantly. Davis had been the son-in-law of President Zachary Taylor with his first marriage, and their estrangement over the marriage and sudden death of the Taylor daughter had been rectified when Davis served under Taylor in the Mexican War, the initial invasion of Mexico. So the Taylors welcomed the senator from Mississippi and his wife, his family. Whenever they wanted to go to the White House, they did, and Verena was the sort of woman who would take full advantage of that. It was known in Washington that no one outside of the Davis family, the Taylor family, had such access to the White House as the Davises. While Davis and Taylor's successor, Millard Fillmore, had opposing issues over the Compromise of 1850, the Davises still shone brightly at Fillmore's official functions. And with the advent of President Franklin Pierce, the connection was quite as strong as it had been with Taylor. Mrs. Davis became a confidant of the grieving Jane Pierce, who remained disconsolate over the deaths of her two sons. Washington's social season was brisk and elegant, flavored by elected officials from all over the nation and diplomats from all over the world. It was the luster of this scene that Jefferson Verena Davis tried to carry over to the Confederate White House, believing, it seems, that they were keeping alive that aspect of the spirit of the real American nation and also optimism. The dinner table fare was memorable, and as Jefferson Davis's biographer William Cooper remarked in his remarkable book, it was both simple and sumptuous. There was gumbo, there were ducks, calf livers, chicken and jelly, oysters in season or preserved, claret soup, champagne, brains prepared in a special French way, and the usual southern foods as cornbread, biscuits, sausages, and hams. Game was available in the local markets of Richmond. A particular treat was remembered by Judah P. Benjamin, a very well-fed man, if there ever was one. And this was anchovy paste spread over bread with walnuts crushed, scattered thickly over it. The bread, of course, had to come from Crenshaw's Bakery in Richmond. No other bread would do. And the walnuts were from the trees in the garden behind the house. Mrs. Davis herself was a good cook and had dealt with the staff always, so she could instruct her chef. Alas, the president, like Lincoln, was indifferent to food. He might call for a plate of turnip greens and cornbread when a delicate repast lay on the table. Or he might simply overlook a meal and forget about it, not eat at all, unless his wife made him. The Confederate president entertained frequently. Mrs. Chestnut commented that she and Mrs. Davis missed the lively seasons in Washington. But as for themselves, they were not going to be, as she put it, pillars of salt. Teas, receptions, dinners were all reminiscent of Washington's social ways. Northern newspapers looked at interest with social life in the Confederate White House, reporting once that Davis' guests had danced on the American flag. Well, this, long said, may in fact have been the case, and if so, it doubtless stemmed from a custom dear to Washington in the 1850s. At dances, a more or less smooth floor was desirable, but it was impeded by splintery bare floors, as well as tacked-down wall-to-wall carpeting, usual to well-appointed houses of the time. So linen sheeting, which was called a crash, was spread over the floors wall-to-wall and weighted with stones around the edges. Scattered with wax particles, ground up from candles, it provided the necessary smooth surface. An innovation to this custom in the 50s was to call in a decorative painter with his colored chalks and have him create a scene over the crash, which dancing feet would wear away by the end of the evening. The design might be anything from a ship at full sail, a battle scene, signing the Declaration of Independence, a cityscape, or a fantasy. There is no evidence that Davis ever ordered such a confection, but if he did, it's probably unlikely he would use the American flag. But the report, perhaps doctored up even and invented by some patriotic newsman, created quite a stir in its time and for years after. Richmond at first attempted to snub the social and political intruders, but this accomplished nothing. A shrewd Verena Davis, equipped with position, was quite accustomed to having her way, and she got it. She played her role, attending public functions, sitting now and then in the Capitol gallery and listening to the debates, making her obligatory social calls in her coach so many mornings a week. 15 minutes was the maximum stay. She held fundraisers, as we would call them, and women's sewing events. She lined the mansion's mantelpieces with whittled souvenirs made for her by soldiers in the hospitals, and she dressed in silk and lace and was ever the talkative hostess, a foil to her more serious husband, the chief of state. Social activity came not so easily for the Lincoln household. One reason was Mrs. Lincoln, a woman that tragedy both haunted from the past and faced her at the White House. She emerges from her letters and the historic documents as one who just simply couldn't cope. I think if you read the big volume of her letters, that's what you come up with. Well, she just was one who just didn't quite have it. High-strung and insecure, she was vulnerable to the most unkind gossip that Verena Davis would have ignored. And as I've said, was the first president's wife ever treated unfavorably in the press. In fact, she was probably the worst political wife one could imagine. Gossip accompanied her to Washington. In writing to one of the Irish maids who had worked for Buchanan, Harriet Lane repeated what she had heard, that Mrs. Lincoln was awfully Western, loud and vulgar in her manners. In the winter of 1861, Washington was a very socially conscious southern city, receiving a Midwestern housewife, wife of a president not many people of the old guard welcomed. While the city soon received a flood of newcomers, the first impression of Mary Lincoln remained, where she was nearly always lonely, at times tremblingly angry and vindictive, and often blue. Verena Davis was an eternal optimist and surrounded with people and conducted herself as right hand to her husband. In each case, the situation was largely the woman's own choice. Mrs. Lincoln was never really able to manage the White House. She wanted to, but it proved inadequate to meet the many and varied demands it presented. Lincoln realized this, and in the light of the importance of entertaining and functions at the White House and how they presented the president, he entirely deferred all that to the Department of State. He thus took from his wife any idea that he trusted her in such matters and took away the job she very much wanted and believed she could do. She tried to glow in other ways. In some ways she succeeded. She was a vigilant friend of the Army hospitals in the Washington area, calling on the wounded soldiers often, and was saluted by the soldiers with the warmest praise. Camp Mary Lincoln was named by vote of grateful soldiers on the outskirts of Washington. Yet she conducted herself in ways a wiser woman would certainly have avoided. If Mrs. Davis sent an order for furniture to Europe, sight unseen, of course, Mrs. Lincoln decided to buy furniture in person. Well, this opened some doors. She went to Philadelphia only a month or so after the inauguration and began buying. Her purchases were stylish and elaborate, including china, silver, and a gaudy bedstead that was draped in purple and yellow satin and white lace, all falling from a golden crown at the ceiling. She wanted this most elegant bed to climax the room on the north side that they were calling the Prince of Wales room, where the Prince had stayed, Edward Albert had stayed, honoring the visits there by Victoria and Albert's son, and removing the homely old four-poster that was there that looked like a farmhouse. She didn't keep a good tally of her purchases, nor did the Commissioner of Public Buildings, who was supposed to do that and manage the accounts. But he was such a sycophant that he lost track of the facts. The bills were huge. Lincoln finally, showman, rose in rage. There were months overdue, and cried, "It would stink in the nostrils of the American people to know that while our soldiers needed blankets, we were buying flub dubs for this damned old house." He declared that he had paid for the purchases himself, which he apparently did either by finding the funds in one of the departments or taking it from the $20,000 allowance. It's not traceable. The subject never came up again, but the bed, ironically, is passed down through history as the Lincoln bed, which he truly despised. It's only in connection to him where that his wife bought it, his son Willie died on it, and he himself was embalmed at its foot. Mrs. Lincoln could be very kind or very vindictive, seemingly quite at will. Servants departed one by one under the heat of her rages, for she always blamed any mistake on everyone but herself. Their places were taken by less desirables who humored her with flattery. One White House employee who had been there since before Lincoln was a Scot named John Watt. The White House being a much larger house than the Richmond White House, it had room for many different things to go on in it. One thing was a conservatory, and that was kept by Watt as the gardener. This retreat, this conservatory, was built on top of the west wing, and the gardener was often there in the course of his work. It also was a great place on a cold day when the sun was coming in and the tropical plants were blooming for the family to take its leisure, and Mrs. Lincoln loved it. She loved it to walk among the roses and camellias. Watt gained a level of familiarity with Mrs. Lincoln that most people in her position wouldn't have allowed. It led to free access for him to the White House. When one of Lincoln's speeches appeared in the press days before he presented it, an investigation was made, and the source of the theft, direct from Lincoln's desk, was Watt. Banished from the White House, he was given a choice of prison or joining the Army. It appears to have taken the latter, although I've been unable to trace it back. Maybe someone here will do that. The Lincoln White House rather ambled on through the war. Lincoln set great trust in his secretary, George Nicolay, and also William Seward, the Secretary of State, whom Mrs. Lincoln loathed. And then there was William Hunter, the institutional member since 1833. The basic concerns of most White House functions then and even today are, one, to present the president in a favorable, warm light, and two, to successfully manage crowds. A New Year's or 4th of July reception in Lincoln's time was likely to attract between 6,000 and 10,000 callers. The doors were just closed and the line was cut off. It was unending. It was utterly exhausting for the president and his wife. And it was after just such a New Year's reception in 1863 that Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in his office upstairs, rubbing his bruised hands so that the pen would not quiver and the people think he hesitated. Public access to Lincoln's White House was constant. Thomas Jefferson had first opened the main floor rooms to the public, then unfinished, in 1801. The custom continued into Lincoln's time, with the East Room available 5.5 days a week, and the Blue, Green, and Red Rooms only now and then. Privacy for the president has always been a major issue at the White House, the ultimate fishbowl. It was no different in Lincoln's time. The Lincolns used the Red Room for a parlor. Here the newspapers were piled on the center table, and rubber hoses connected to the arms of the chandelier fueled the table lamps to read by. Before a coal fire, with lap robes over their legs, the Lincolns spent winter evenings discussing what they read. They had memorized favorite texts from Shakespeare and were well studied in his plays and loved to relive scenes and acts that meant a lot to them. Lincoln made the Bible a lifetime personal concentration and liked to review his thoughts with her. We don't really know what they said, but by application that he did, there must have been a great deal of depth to her and understanding of this. At times, he would vault up and walk to the service stairs across the hall and cross the lawn to the War Department to read telegraph messages, then return to his wife. In such a context, they lived such private lives as history was to allow them. The historical greatness of a house lies often in the personal lives its occupants live there, and not in the events that find space in the more comprehensive narratives. Both Lincoln's and Davis's houses are rich in personal history that brings us closer to the occupants and thus closer to their times. They tease our imagination and give us a context for historical narratives. The Lincolns brought to the White House the hard memory of losing a son, Eddie, as did the Davises, who lost their firstborn at the age of 2 in Washington. Willie Lincoln died probably of typhoid in the White House on February the 20th, 1862, 11 months after his father's first inauguration. His life simply slipped away. He became ill and in 4 days was gone. The Lincolns buried him temporarily in a friend's mausoleum. In the spring of 1864, Joseph Davis II, who was 5, imitating an act he saw in the circus, was balancing himself on the handrail of the rear colonnade of the Confederate White House when he fell to his death on the pavement. While in the presidency, the Davises were still having children. They were more lax and interactive with their own, while the Lincolns closeted their sons to protect them, and after Willie's death, kept Tad almost under guard. Lincoln's sons were spoiled with ponies, a theater. Select children of their friends were invited to play with them. We recently turned up, the White House Historical Association has turned up some photographs of some of these children at play on the South Lawn. The Lincoln children were schooled by a tutor, an adoring old Scot named Alexander Williamson. But the boys rarely went beyond the iron fences surrounding the grounds. Davis children, on the other hand, seemed to have had much more freedom, the boys playing with neighborhood children in the street, and even bringing home a young black friend, John Henry Brooks, whom the Davises took to live as part of the family. Even so, Mrs. Chestnut thought the Davis family was very isolated, and wrote in 1862, "One might as well be in a balloon as shut up in that Bottimore house." The two households were guarded, of course, if not to the extent the White House is today. Had there as yet been no assassinations to a president, but there were threats against Lincoln and Davis constantly. One plot against Lincoln was turned up on his way to Washington in 1861. Very public threats against Davis appeared in the northern press. Jim Lane and his Kansas volunteers very inconveniently moved into the East Room after Lincoln was inaugurated, and a company of soldiers camped in the White House grounds for the duration of the war. They finally got rid of Jim Lane and sent him to war. At night, one soldier walked back and forth the length of the long corridor upstairs. Another paced a similar corridor in the basement, and still another was staged at the front door. Shutters were barred and locked on the south. The cloak and dagger was profuse and much talked about in wartime at the White House. Even a report went around of a mysterious infernal machine or bomb placed in the basement pantry beneath the state dining room. That may have been a hoax, may not have been a hoax. We really don't know. But it was no accident that Mrs. Lincoln's carriage, one supposed to have been used that day by the president, was rigged to fall apart on the day of Gettysburg, and did so on her way into town from the soldiers' home. The Confederate White House was guarded even less. There was a guard stationed outside the main doorway. A guard accompanied Davis sometimes, but not all the time. He walked rather freely by himself in the streets of Richmond, talking to people along the way. A guard stood out his rather modest office in the Treasury downtown. Yet, for the apparent laxity, Davis worried about the safety of his family. Even at the time of his inauguration, he considered sending his wife and children away. Lincoln, likewise, considered sending his family to New England. In both cases, the wives refused to go, although Mrs. Davis did leave Richmond with the children on several occasions for family-oriented visits. As the war grew to its close, the public appearances at the White House swelled. Mrs. Lincoln's agony seems to have subsided a little. Receptions increased in number, military reviews, speeches from the window over the front door, and a very crowded Washington swirled around the Lincoln's house as never before. As the end came for the Confederacy, the Davises made their preparations to depart. They held at the White House a sale of household goods that were their own possessions. Varina, the children, and servants departed by train. Davis had stuffed her reticule with gold. He remained in Richmond until the 2nd and left by boat by river with his cabinet headed to the south side. Richmond in flames was invaded by Union forces the next day. The first weeks of April thus presented a dramatic climax to the era, but the story of the Lincolns and the Davises was not over. On April 4th, 1 month to a day after his second inauguration, Lincoln rose early to go to Richmond to dramatize the victory. He declined to use the sumptuous railroad car waiting for him in Alexandria, just finished and still smelling of varnished champagne, but he went on a regular train car. Accompanied by a crowd of newspaper people, as he walked the smoky streets, a path through thousands of spectators, he drew all the symbolic opportunity he could draw from the visit. At the presidential house, he climbed the circular stairs and sat at Davis's desk. 10 days later, April 14th, the war all but ended. He was dead. 3 weeks thereafter, in the midst of national anguish over the murder of the Liberator, at a junction of events almost biblical in its dramatic power, Jefferson Davis was apprehended in a rainy Georgia woods. Mary Lincoln sank into grief and a troubled widowhood. She lost Tad Lincoln as a teenager, then was left only with Robert, her eldest. Going through a series of humiliating public episodes, she lived in Europe for a while, then in days. Favors were granted. Davis, imprisoned for a while, was released, and they lived in their family until his death at a friend's residence in New Orleans in 1889, by which time he was almost alive. The amazing Verena Howell lived on. Verena Howell Davis lived on, emerging on her own in the public eye as a journalist. She died in New York City, August the 16th, 1906, at the age of 80. Hardly had the era of 4 years ended, then the survivors saw almost incredible change. Their passions and devotions became those of another time, even as Davis occupied the Richmond house, the Capitol's Iron Dome he had approved and supported, while in the Senate rose to completion, the foremost symbol the war had produced the Union. The wheels of industry were turned by the needs of war at a greater speed than ever known. Never had the recent past seemed so very distant. The two presidential houses of that climactic era survived. The one here was completed about 1818, while the White House in Washington was rebuilt by 18 after its destruction in the War of 1812. By 1861, they were in a sense the same age. The Confederate White House reflects one episode in American history. The White House in Washington reflects many. Yet it was the Lincoln melodrama that was to save the White House from demolition through the 19th century. This was where the Lincoln story had taken place, and Americans were acutely aware of it. So both of these buildings are powerful symbols of the Civil War. Lincoln's White House still presents the historic image to the street. Inside, Lincoln might recognize the layout of rooms, but would wonder where the creaky wooden floors had gone, the smelly gas light, the terrible heating system. His successors, Theodore Roosevelt and Harry Truman, replaced those creaky floors with stone and about everything else they could replace. The Confederate White House, closed up for some years with dozens of the Confederate furniture stores in the main rooms, was always a shrine. It would have been hard to consider any other time in its history than the Civil War. Mrs. Lincoln never entered the White House after she departed in May 1865. But Verena Davis went back to the Broken Barrow House often. She was active in the creation of the museum and even wrote artifact labels, which survive and are shown to you today. The White House of the Confederacy is a national historic monument, historic landmark, under the protection of the Congress. The White House in Washington is not. Prohibited by law from that designation because the President has total authority over it, and Congress will allow no interference with that. So the White House moves on, still the President's house it has been for 2 centuries. To recall the Civil War there, one's imagination must take flight. At the Confederate White House, the imagination gets a lot of help. The isolation of its moments in time provide the opportunity for a total recall of the material surroundings in one of the significant places in that particular time when the nation was torn apart and put back together again. Thank you.